You need to stop using the word Trinity.
And the
That's
word
clear.
Bible.
And anyone who argues such things should also stop using the word Bible.
Yeah.
We've all agreed Bob will no longer use the word Trinity.
So long as those that argue such things stop using the word Bible. Yeah.
Psychology of behavior. That's what I did to study.
Yeah. So I want to talk about three things.
Alright.
The first one is the recent terrorist attacks and why it keeps happening. Why it continues to happen, that again and again and again we're having terrorist attacks right across the world and here in the West. And it's because it's quite possible to construct a narrative of violence, a narrative of resistance, a narrative of jihad from the Quran and the Hadiths. And it goes without saying that the vast majority of Muslims don't tap into that narrative. The vast majority of Muslims, when they come across that narrative, are disgusted by it. Now, those that do, and then go on to believe it and commit themselves to it, commit themselves to acts of violence which we then see. And unfortunately, the death of Western civilization will continue by 1,000 cuts because our liberal, progressive, ideological elites are incapable of seeing the world for what it is and for seeing the world how it is. And so they refuse to accept that this violence that a tiny minority of Muslims are participating in is inspired by Islamic texts. Now, there's been research done by a number of research bodies, Pew Research being one of them. There was another one done in the UK, I can't remember its name, but its findings were broadcast on Channel 4 that clearly demonstrate that a higher percentage of Muslims accept the use of violence under certain circumstances than we would feel comfortable with. Upwards of 30% would accept violence to defend the name of Muhammad. Now that is clearly not 100%. That clearly means that you're going to meet lots of Muslims who will genuinely, hand on heart, say they find this violence disgusting. And they do, they're not lying to you, it's not taqiyya. However, ISIS has demonstrated that there are tens of thousands of Muslims that are embracing a narrative of violence. And that can't be denied. And the liberal progressive state, because of its individualistic ideology and because of its moral relativism, refuses to see the world for what it is. They refuse to accept the reality that there will always be a tiny minority of Muslims that will tap into those jihadist narratives and then act on them. They will always write it off as something else, a distortion of Islam, a perversion of Islam, they call it. However, anyone who knows church history as a Christian knows that actually we've experienced as Christians 1400 years of Islamic violence. There has never, ever been a century or a year in which Muslims have not attacked Christians. Ever. At all. And it is time for us Christians to speak our own history, to tell our own truth as an antidote to the poison of liberal progressive ideology that refuses to accept this reality. Now, we know, we've already stated, that many Muslims genuinely and hand on heart are against this kind of violence. They are. There'll always be that tiny minority that buy into it. The statistics show that that minority is numbered around maybe 2 or 3% of the overall Muslim population. 2 or 3% of 1 billion people is 40 million people. That's a big number. That means that this problem is not going away. And as the percentage of Muslims grows within a population, the percentage or the number, the absolute number of those Muslims who accept violence also grows. 2 to 3% of 100 Muslims is 2 or 3 people. You can do the multiplications. What happens when that 100 becomes 1,000? What happens when that 1,000 becomes 1,000,000? What happens when that 1,000,000 becomes 10 million? You see the problem. Liberal progressive ideology refuses to accept that there is a problem of prejudice and bigotry and hate emanating from within the Muslim community. That doesn't mean all Muslims have bigotry and hatred in their heart, but it means that some do, and they do for Islamic reasons. And until the liberal progressive state can accept that fact, like they accept the fact that Nazism leads to prejudice on the basis of ethnicity, they will never, ever be able to address the problem of Muslim violence. You have to challenge the prejudice that is rooted in the Islamic ideology if you want to tackle the problem. You have to want to tackle that narrative if you want to tackle the problem. You aren't going to do that if you refuse to accept that there's a problem with the ideology itself. And that is why I say to all of you who can hear my voice that liberal progressive secularism is not the answer. A muscular Christian faith is the answer. A muscular Christian faith that can stand up to an ideology that preaches that kind of hatred. That can say to the Muslim, there is a genuine better alternative. Something that teaches a better way. Liberal culture has to abandon the idea of relativism, that all cultures are equal, that all cultures teach the same, that all cultures have the same problems. They don't have the same problems because they don't teach the same things. Genital mutilation is not a problem of Anglo-Saxon culture. Alcohol abuse is. Muslim communities don't suffer from alcohol abuse, but there is the use of genital mutilation. The fact of the matter is, different cultures don't have the same values. They don't ascribe values to the same things in the same ways, and resultantly, therefore, they don't have the same problems. There is a reason why there isn't a problem of Jainist terrorists blowing people up around the world. Why? Because you can't find a more pacifist religion than Jainism. If someone is a fundamentalist Jainist, they will never hurt anyone. Jainists try not to hurt flies. So it is wrong to say that all religions have the same problem. All religions teach the same thing. Islam teaches a supremacist ideology that the Muslims are the best of people. It teaches that those who are not Muslims are ritually unclean. It teaches that Christians and Jews should be made into second-class citizens. And I have 1400 years of church history to prove that that is the reality, not what your politicians tell you, not what your celebrities tell you. I have 1400 years of Christian experience to prove my point. And so, liberal progressive ideology will never address this point. The reality is, we have to find a better answer to this problem. And that is going to be found in an adoption of a muscular Christian faith. Now, the government is following a strategy at this moment in time to deal with terrorism. The strategy is this. Let's use a metaphor. The terrorists are fish, and the river is the vast majority of Muslims. The policy of Western governments at this time, its strategy, is to poison the river for the fish. That's the idea. To turn the vast majority of Muslims against the Islamists. That's the strategy. The evidence would suggest that it isn't working, that it isn't dealing with the problem. Absolutely, there are some Muslims who are 100% against terrorism. They definitely exist. Some Muslims literally put their lives on the line fighting against Islamist terrorists. However, overall, we can see that that strategy is not working. It may be the case that it's too early, and that in 80 years' time it will eventually work. But right now, ISIS has demonstrated that if anything, this supremacist ideology is gaining traction amongst more Muslims than not. There are more Muslims willing to accept it each day. The security forces are constantly exposing plots by terrorists and protecting us. The number of those plots has increased, not decreased. Now, there's another alternative. You change the course of the river. The river that was once flowing in one direction, you flow into another direction. You make the river different. In other words, you seek the conversion of Muslims. You drain the river so that the fish are easier to spot. Liberal progressives understood this when they fought. Liberals understood this when they fought against communism. They understand it when they fight against Nazism. Why do they not understand it when they fight against radical Islam? It is because their pluralist rhetoric has blinded them to options that are readily available. Now, changing the topic slightly.
New topic?
New topic.
Okay, cool.
I want to talk about the election.
Right.
I think that we in the UK can be proud of our democracy, because the kind of tensions that we felt in our society over the last couple of days. Let him. It's all right. It's a free park. Let him. We'll move if he starts talking. So, in the election, we can be proud that our democracy is strong. The tensions that we experienced in this country would have led to civil wars in many other countries. Many other countries would have ripped themselves to pieces if they encountered divisions like we have in the UK. The fact that we didn't have great civil strife or fighting in the street demonstrates the fact that the idea of democracy is strong in the UK. And to you who live in countries that fight one another over your political differences, you've seen an example recently in our election on how to resolve your differences without the use of violence. Without the use of violence. However, the left wing are people who are baffled by the fact that the working classes of the North have rejected them. The Labour Party is scratching its head as to why people in the North rejected them and went Tory. Well, the answer I would suggest to them is very simple. The working class, as was formerly understood by the socialists as a body politic who bought into a narrative of class struggle against the upper elites, no longer exists. There is no identifiable working class that believes in class struggle. That narrative has been rejected by the working poor, which is a much better description than working class. The working poor are patriotic. Too many leading members of the Labour Party have contempt for the idea of British identity. They have contempt for the British Army, and they have contempt for patriotism. The socialists of London, the champagne socialists of Islington, like Jeremy Corbyn, who had a private education, went to a private school, and many of his acolytes who work within the upper echelons of the Labour Party fetishise the working class of the North. They fetishise them and see them as some kind of puppy to be patronised and looked after. The Labour Party does not speak to aspiration. It does not speak to working class families who want to progress in life, who have a sense not of class struggle, but of familial or individual struggle. They're much more Nietzschean than they are Marxist communist. We got an ambulance coming. The reality is that the working class of the North are much more akin to the narrative of Tommy Robinson than they are to the narrative of Jeremy Corbyn. However, the fact remains that people are slow, as it were, to catch on to their beliefs and their political expression. There is a lie within British politics that you have to vote for one of the big three: Labour, Conservative or Liberal Democrat, or now in Scotland the SNP. This lie is sustained by the first past the post electoral system, which distorts our democracy and means that lots of people vote for parties that they don't really believe in to stop the party that they hate more getting into power. That is not how democracy should work.
Who invented democracy, Bob Taylor?
Democracy came from Greece.
Thank you, Demokratia.
Now,
Thank you.
now, what Britain needs, what Britain needs is a reform of the electoral process. A different voting system that will allow people's votes to count for something, so that people feel free to vote for the party that they believe in rather than the party they feel they have to vote for to stop the other party they hate more getting into power. And that means we need a reform of our electoral system. And you will see when that happens, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrat Party utterly collapse. There'll be a mixture of minority parties in the Parliament, a varied multitude of different parties, and they'll have to form coalitions. The point that everyone forgets about the first past the post system is that it was always designed to keep power in the hands of the powerful. It was designed to make sure that the social elites stay in control. And that's why it needs to be reformed. We are seeing in this moment in time, people are emerging, a new political movement is emerging, a new awakening of political activism amongst the working poor. We saw it in Brexit, and we've seen it in the last few elections, and it is socially conservative, not socially progressive. And until Labour addresses that fact and drops the ridiculous narrative of the London metropolitan elites and their fancy to do virtue signalling politics, Labour will continue to hemorrhage the vote of the working poor, because the working poor is socially right-wing and economically left-wing. And that's what Labour needs to realise about the north of England and why it lost in the north of England most recently.